Good evening. I just thought I'd give a quick abridged version um, for yourselves to help you with the report and a bit of the estimating part, the second assignment that you need for the report. So I will run through all-in rates, I think, on a separate video. I have one, but I don't. When I went through it, it wasn't that good. So I'll redo it, I think. But what I want to look at is how do we calculate labour costs, um, analyze the different factors that make up um, an all-in rate, and also for the merits on assignment 2 to do with learning outcome 3 and learning outcome 4, you need to really analyze the different types of methods that you would use with regards to estimating. Now, this links back to the first assignment because it links nicely to NRM1 and the different methods you would use to quantify something to prepare a budget. So ultimately, when you were looking at the merits and the distinction in this particular case, you were looking at why does it sort of fluctuate and change. Ultimately, when a contractor submits his or her tender, why are they widely different sometimes from each other? Why are they different from the original budget? Okay, I don't think that you need to move on to the next stage, where the next stage would be obviously as the contract itself varies throughout the duration of the construction phase, the final sum varies. And there's lots of studies, certainly done by the RICS and the CIOB, which looks into this factor. Why are we why are we sort of why are our final accounts ultimately anywhere between 10 and 30, sometimes 40% higher than what we originally budgeted for, or what we had promised the client at the beginning in our tender? And the Egan report goes on about this, the Latham report goes on about it, and there have now been subsequent studies since those two sort of, if you like, landmark studies in the mid 1990s. Okay, so I don't think you need to talk about Latham or Egan or anything else that has come from it subsequently, but what the question ultimately is asking is, why? Why is there so much difference sometimes between the final tender submission between the, say, 6 different contractors that may have submitted a tender, and why the one that you eventually choose, why is that maybe higher or lower than what you originally budgeted for? And then it's going on to ask you to analyze the different estimating techniques. Now, you've already done that to a degree when you talked about NRM1 in the first assignment. Fundamentally, you're talking about quantification, I know, but you're also talking about the way we produce budgets. So if we do a cost estimate based on, say, the functional floor area or the gross internal floor area, or if we do an elemental cost plan, or we then produce an elemental cost plan with elemental unit rates, or an elemental cost plan with approximate quantities, and from those approximate quantities, we will then carry out, we will then be able to produce a budget, usually based upon things like SPONS, the stuff in SPONS, or the BCIS database, the Building Cost Index database, the BCI database. so you can sort of link it to what you'd already said in some respects in learning outcome one. But this time you're taking it a step further, because you're not just building these budgets. What the PQS has done, the professional or private quantity surveyor has done, the cost consultant has actually done, is come up with these various budgets based on the information that they've got at the time as they move along. If you like, if we use the RIBA plan of works, as you move along the RIBA plan of works from sort of stage 0 and 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, to producing, if you like, either approximate quantities or accurate quantities with regard to a bill of quantities or an approximate bill of quantities, or if it's design and build, which in this case it's not. I've kept it to traditional, so keep referring back to the case study. They would build something like a bill of quantities, and from there you can carry out analytical estimating techniques. Now, analytical estimating techniques, compared to the elemental cost plan or the build-up of an elemental unit rate, an EUR, for instance, is based on much more accurate data, up-to-date data. It's not historical in nature, because it's fundamentally based upon things such as material cost, plant cost, labour cost, up-to-date plant and labour and material time and motion studies. Then fundamentally, it's much more accurate because it's based on today's data. When I say today's data, the data that you've collated or have got in relation to the day that you're producing your estimate, i.e. as a contractor. So, and you're actually analysing it now. So you're actually breaking down, say, a metre cubed of concrete. You're actually breaking it down into, well, look, I need a metre cubed of concrete. What have I got to do? What do I need to produce and lay a metre cubed of concrete? Well, I'm going to need concrete. I'm going to need a certain mix, C20, C30. Where am I going to get that from? Or one of the suppliers, that are very close by to the site. Because obviously transport costs for the concrete producer is going to affect the amount they're going to charge from the material price. So you've got your material price, which tarmac might do for you, Hanson may do for you. So you've got that already. But it's not just about the materials. There's a wastage factor. There's a bulking factor. And what I mean by bulking is that, you need a vibro compactor, if you like, because it's got air in it. It's, 40% of it will be air when it's delivered to site. So you need to vibrate it so that the air comes out. And it obviously reduces then the amount of concrete that you need. So you need to take those things into consideration. You need to hire one, maybe. Okay, so you may need to hire a vibrator, okay, for the concrete, and that's a cost. It could be, I don't know, £20 a day. But you've got then, so if it's say £20 a day, you've got to reduce that £20 using various studies out there, various constants. You've got to reduce that down to a metre cubed. So everything is always working back to a metre cubed. So there's your plant. You may need a dumper. You may need a pump. All of these things that you need to decide. And that will be based on the drawings and the information that you've got. So for instance, the Chartered Institute of Builders, in the guidance for project managers, and their guidance, for producing a tender, they recommend that you go out on the estimator and the planning engineer and the site manager that's been selected for it go out on site at least once before they produce the estimate. Usually, obviously, you've got to ask permission from the client, so they can sort of give them the scope of the site. Do you need, for instance, to move materials? So do I need, for instance, a forklift truck? Do I need a dumper? What size dumper do I need? What size forklift truck do I need? All of these things, if you need them, then you might need to add them to your unit rate. And different contractors will approach this in different ways. Some may well just rely on labour, pure labour, rather than maybe plant. Maybe they do a cost exercise, and it's maybe cheaper to move using a wheelbarrow and a couple of labourers, rather than maybe a dumper or maybe a telehandler, a forklift, So you're really analysing everything. How long do I need it for? So there's your planning engineer comes in and gives you advice on that. How long does it take to move a metre squared of bricks or a metre cubed of concrete? How long do I need a pump for instance? If I can't sort of pour the concrete straight in, do I need to sort of just reverse the truck up to a certain point and then from there use a pump? In this case, I wouldn't have thought you need to use a pump because it's only 1 story high. So it's not a big building, it's only going into the ground. So I think you can just sort of move it very quickly. So there's your plant, there's your materials, and then how much labour do you need? And again, it's an educated guess. It's looking at the site. What type of, we know that it's a raft foundation, so it's got to be poured quite straight and just sort of put in straight away. So you're going to need at least 2 or 3 labourers and a vibro compactor. I call it a vibro compactor, a vibrator basically, to get all the air out. So the person who's in charge of that operation, the ganger or the the lead operative, if you like, is going to get paid more because they're in charge of the operation. They're going to say to the other labourers, or operatives as I should call them, where they need to place the concrete. And they're going to control everything with a shovel and with the sort of poker vibrator. So they're the things that you need to decide. And that's what we mean by analytical estimating techniques. In many respects, it's less, you are going to require some historical data. You know what I mean? Like, it takes, say, 1.5 hours to lay a metre squared of bricks. So that's historic. It takes, 15 minutes to sort of place 15 minutes, 0.25 of an hour, maybe 0.15 of an hour, actually about 8 to 10 minutes to lay 1 metre cubed of concrete. All of this is data that's been produced over time. And obviously, as technology and equipment has improved and techniques have changed, it's got quicker and quicker and quicker as we use much more lean sort of techniques, as we call lean manufacturing techniques. So that's what we mean by analytical estimating. And if you look at like the criteria there, the higher criteria I'm talking about here, the merit and the distinction, you're actually asking yourself, why is it different to what we originally budgeted it for? And it's different because it's much more analytical. One would argue it's much, much more accurate. So because what we've based it on with regards to it when we did our original budgets using NRM1 techniques, yes, it's very systematic, so therefore it makes it quite accurate, but we're relying on historical data. This time we're actually, again, building it upon a systematic framework, NRM1, NRM2, but this time we're looking at it in a much more up-to-date, much more analytical way. That's one of the reasons why there's a difference. And that's one of the reasons why there's differences between the different contractors' prices, because they will approach it in different ways. Some contractors will have the capacity to use much, much more up-to-date technologies. Other contractors won't. Other contractors will be much, much more traditional in their approach. Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about here. So I'm just going to skip through these a minute. I will go through these, I promise. So what the P says is, well, how do you work out the labour rate? Well, the labour rate is worked out using what we call the working rule agreement, and that changes each year. And the working rule agreement is basically an agreement between the different employers and employer organisations. Yeah. The unions, the different professionals, organisations, particularly the RICS in this case, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, the Chartered Institute of Builders, okay? And what it does is it takes into consideration the minimum hourly rate you should charge for various types of operative on site. Okay, and it's just a starting point ultimately, and what it recommends is that you take into consideration the basic wage, holiday pay, national insurance, pension, travel in some cases, not all the time, but travel in some cases, training, health and safety, insurances. All of these things that you need to take into consideration to make sure that your costs as a contractor or subcontractor are met. Okay, so this is a minimum that they recommend, so for this particular case, yeah, it's £24.64 an hour, and that's how they've got to that figure. For this particular type of operative, it's £20.37. For a basic operative, it's £20.70. Okay, and each operative goes up, and obviously a craftsperson is paid more than a operative, and different operatives will be paid different prices. So for instance, a steel fixer, which would be considered if you like semi-skilled, or a semi-skilled operative, would be paid at the higher rate of the operative price. A basic operative would be paid at the lower rate. Somebody who can drive a dumper truck will be paid a little bit more because they bring this basic skills and expertise with them, and that needs to be recognised. And this is how you build up the unit rate for labour, and that's in one of the passes there in the second assignment. So I would write about that in your report. Just moving on a second, bear with me. The other thing then is what I was talking about, so you need to write about that, because obviously different contractors and subcontractors are going to approach it in different ways. And that's why the final tender sum, it's one of the reasons why, the final tender sum will change. The other thing, more probably, and you're probably aware of this from your own practice, is ultimately, how much do I want to win this project? How much do I need to win this project? So we call that commercial and contractual risk, and from that you can work out your profit and your general overheads. Remember, your general overheads are not your preliminaries. Your preliminaries are site overheads, which are usually 10% of your estimated price, or then at the end of the contract 10% of the final sum. That's a general sort of percentage there, so forgive me. So you actually need to take into consideration how much you really want to win this contract, and that will depend on a variety of factors. How you are set up as a contractor, whether you're a risk-averse contractor, or whether you're a contractor that's quite happy to take risks. So, and that will be reflected ultimately in your profit margin. Okay, your general overheads are based on things like your office costs, your general office costs. So you'll have some if you're a regional contractor, for instance, based in Gloucester, you'll have one office maybe. Okay, so you'll have one office, and the centre of that office would be probably in Gloucester City, Gloucester or Cheltenham, in a big town or a big city within the region, and that that region then would cover Gloucester, parts of South Wales, parts of Bristol, and go into probably somewhere like Wiltshire and even Oxfordshire. But that's probably as far as it'll sort of contract. And obviously, the further away it gets away from that regional centre, the more risk it's taking, and therefore it's then whether how much do they really need to do they really need to work up in Birmingham. And it maybe they do, because there's not much work going on at this particular time in their region, whether it's Gloucester, whether it's Cardiff, whether it's Liverpool. So there's a lot of construction, I know, because I live in Birmingham. There's a lot of construction going on in Birmingham at the moment. So maybe you might want to compete for some of the work there. And then that would be reflected then on how you approach your tender sum. Okay, and usually it's reflected in the percentage that you give yourself for profit. Okay, obviously the lower the profit, the keener that you are willing to go, the probably the more you want the job for whatever reason it may be, and it could be because of a lack of work. Usually it's because of a lack of work, or you want to set yourself up in a new region. You want to expand maybe. So if you want to expand, you're going to take risks. So for instance, if you have got aspirations to win a lot of contracts in Birmingham, you might set up another office temporarily on a short-term lease maybe, to start to win some contracts or projects, I should say, in Birmingham or Liverpool or Manchester, which is, again, however, it's outside your scope because you are used to working in a certain region and you understand that region quite a lot, and you've got a lot of networks, very close networks, maybe within the local councils, within the trade, within the commercial sort of environment, within Gloucester or Gloucestershire, within Bristol, and Cirencester, or even Newport in South Wales. You've got these connections that you've built over time, and what you're doing now, it's a much riskier endeavour, because you may not have those connections or those strong connections then in Birmingham. So you're taking more of a risk, and if you're taking more of a risk, it's whether you're willing to take that risk. Are you willing to, or do you need to take that risk? Sometimes you just need to take it. You got to bite the bullet, if you like. And that's why, the CIOB recommend that you should, if you're doing closed competitive tendering, you should submit from at least 6 contractors. So let's say that in theory that's worked and you've got 6 submissions. So they are going to vary. The prices are going to vary. The tender submissions are going to vary, because it depends ultimately on how much they need or want that project. This is quite a nice project. It's quite straightforward. It's very local, and therefore there's an argument. There's quite a bit of it's quite, if you're quite risk averse, it's quite a nice contract to win, because it's very basic. However, you're not really going to make that much profit, one could argue, in it, but it depends. If you're a large, for instance, if you're a large national contractor or international contractor like Kia's, like some of you work for, you're going to have offices in every major or most major regional centres: London, Birmingham, Cambridge, Gloucester, Cardiff, Bristol, Manchester or Liverpool, Leeds or Sheffield, Newcastle, etc., etc., etc. That costs money. So your general overheads now are going to be much higher than a regional contractor. That's your problem, because your general overheads generally are going to be much, much, much higher. So there's an issue there if you're a regional or you're a national or international contractor. Okay, so a smaller contractor will have less general overheads. However, that's got to be balanced up against the expertise. Do you have the expertise in this type of work? Do you have the expertise and the resources to do it? And again, it will depend. One could argue that a larger contractor will have those resources because they will have those specialist departments. I work for Kia's, as I told you, and I work for Kia Special Works, as it was called. So we did design and build, management contracting. We did a lot of small. When I say small, I mean up to 5 million. But we're talking civil engineering here, which are multi-million. So we did a lot of specialist, small sort of civil engineering contracts, like things like concrete cancer. Sorting out concrete cancer was one of the jobs I once had within the special works. A lot of stuff that I did was design and build. However, we had our special works department, but then we also had a house building department. And then we had a refurbishment department. And then we had a general building department, which sort of did things like, Tesco stores and sports centres. Just very, very straightforward sort of commercial type buildings. So Kia's was set up for different sort of things, So we could tender on different stuff. Regional contractors generally specialise, or they do very general sort of stuff. So again, it depends on whether they really want the job, whether they need the job, whether they're just keeping the client happy by submitting something because they want to stay on the client's sort of tender list. Yeah, you may have a lot of work on, so you may be working at 100 to 120% capacity. Therefore, another contract coming up might be out of scope for you because you've got everybody's employed. All your site managers are working, all your quantity surveyors are working, all your planning engineers are working, etc., etc., etc. So, what do we do in those circumstances? Well, we'll probably put in what we call a cover price, which will be a price with a large profit margin added to it, maybe even less analytical in its approach. And the reason we'll do that as a contractor is because we want to stay on the tender list of this particular client. We might like working for this particular client. It's less risky for working for this particular client. When I work for Kia's, we like working for a particular local authority because for us, they trusted us with a good network and working relationship with them, and therefore we would take some risks with them because we like to keep in with them. However, there were other local authorities that we worked with. One of these local authorities is gone now, so that's why I'll name it. It was South Glamorgan, which is now part of Cardiff City, but back then it was South Glamorgan, and it was a nightmare to work for. You know what I mean? A nightmare. And therefore, if you're submitting a tender for that particular type of client, you may go in, you may be a little bit more risk averse, and your profit margin, you might not want to win that particular contract. But if you put a lot of profit, say a big profit margin on, or a large tender pricing, and you win it because everybody else feels the same way as you, or everybody else, we're in a bit of a bubble, maybe economic bubble, and everybody else is overmanned, got lots of work on, you're going to get much higher tender submissions, and they may be much larger than what was originally budgeted using those techniques in NRM. And there's the thing, that's the difference, you see. Everything is systematic and scientific, but if you take commercial risk out of the picture and how, if you like, a group of human beings think, because it's not just one human being that's going to determine whether you go in keen or the profit margin will be a group of you, you take a little bit of the science out of it and you get people involved in it, and there's an argument that's where the prices and everything changes. I'm going into deep psychology, social psychology there, but I just trying to give you the gist of how to answer it, how to approach it. And if you look at it, it's it's there like market risks, client risks. As I said to you, look, you may know you're dealing with a particular client who are difficult, or because of past experience with them, or that they're pretty good. When I worked for Kia, our general contracting division, for instance, they used to do a lot of work for a large retail chain, supermarket chains. Quite straightforward, bog standard stuff. All supermarkets look the same, as you can imagine. Fantastic client to work for. They set up, they understand everything, they understand how the building industry worked, and much easier to deal with than, say, somebody that may never have, a client. It's a one-off thing maybe for a client to remember. We did a design and build for a local builders merchants in a place in South Wales, I won't mention where. And although they were builders merchants and quite, if you like, well-known builders merchants, just a small local builders merchants, by the way, within South Wales. One would argue, why would they want to do design and build? Because they just didn't understand the concept, and they were very difficult to deal with. Maybe a traditional build would have been better for them, because maybe they would have been more set up for that. And it becomes very difficult, you know what I mean? With regards to that. And also, obviously, the type of procurement, I should call it rather than tender, the type of procurement that you use also adds risk. Traditional sort of spreads the risk. Traditional procurement methods spread the risk 50-50, 60-40 between the contractor and the client. Design and build, though, puts most of the risk, or a lot of the risk, on the contractor, because they're designing it and building it. Management types of contracting, less risk for the contractor, but riskier for the and subcontractors, but riskier then for the client. So it also depends on the type of not just the client, but maybe the procurement method that the client has used. As I say, that's what I'm saying. And in with that, obviously, you've got your different types of contract. JCT, quite straightforward to use. Everybody's familiar with them. Different sort of the different forms, whether it's intermediate, with quantities, without quantities, design and build, management forms of contracting, standard terms and conditions, whether it's NEC 3 or 4 with regards to civil engineering or other engineering type works. If it's the NHS, it would be NEC 3 or NEC 4, and it would be a framework type contract based upon the principles of NEC 3 or NEC 4. That's already written within the agreement with the government with regards to contracting for NHS. So it would depend, obviously, on what contract you use as well, because different contracts will have different risks. NEC spreads the risk between all parties, subcontractor, contractor and client. So therefore is a much better, if you like, a less risk-averse contract. The JCTs, particularly not the design and build, so the more traditional sort of setups with quantities or without quantities, are much more adversarial in nature, less partnering. Therefore, if it's more adversarial, which is how they're written in many respects, because they're written in line with the philosophy of laissez-faire and buyer beware, caveat emptor in law. If they are more riskier, then obviously your submission is going to be, your tender submission, might reflect that. Okay. And obviously then you've got different project risks. Particularly, we don't know what's under the ground half the time. I remember under the old ICE contracts, You know, the contractor and the subcontractor were liable if they found something underground that, they might not be able to see because obviously it wasn't foreseen. These days under the NEC, it's because the NEC took over from the ICE forms of contract, under the NEC, it's less adversarial with regards to that. Okay, so unexpected ground conditions, still under the JCT though, unexpected ground conditions, continuous design changes because it's not buildable, higher temporary work costs, than you originally thought. You start digging down and there's more water. You know what I mean? There's, so you've got to produce some sort of maybe, you've got to design and engineer maybe something like, I don't know, either a temporary or even a permanent dewatering system for the ground, so that the foundations can sort of withstand the pressure that water sort of places upon them. Because one of the things you've got to remember, I don't know whether you've covered this, but this is a generalization, but ultimately watering the ground with soil actually can, in some cases, depends on the soil, but with all soils, it will weaken it. Depending on the soil, it can weaken it up to 50%. All right? So just to sort of let you know, you might have to produce a dewatering system. That's a sort of, pumps and all of that, pumping the waters out. And that might be just temporary whilst you're working in the ground, and then you don't have to have it once you're working on the superstructure, or it could be permanent because of the nature of the groundwater that you've got on site. Okay, obviously infrastructure, temporary roads, temporary services, fencing because you might have security issues. I remember just sort of I try to use examples from my life so that you understand, and you've got your own examples now. You've been working probably long enough. I remember, there's this infamous estate in Wales, in the Rhondda valleys. It's on top of a mountain. It's the fourth most exposed housing development. It's an old 60s housing development in the country. So it's as exposed as some parts of Orkney and Shetland. I think that, and maybe some parts of the Highlands in Scotland, but I think it's the fourth most. It's right on top of a mountain, horrible place to live, the poor people, no amenities. And all the big contractors in the area were invited to submit tenders to do refurbishments on it because it was precast concrete, and there were lots of problems with precast concrete in the 50s and 60s. Where this particular housing estate was built. And obviously there's leaks, there's water leaks, there's condensation, and all the associated problems associated with that, structural problems with the house. And, I only remember it because we in Kiers, we submitted a tender for it, and it was part of the special works because it was precast concrete and concrete cancer. So we submitted it. But at the time I was doing my Chartered Institute of Builders exams. I was an apprentice like you guys, and in there was Amy Construction. I think there was Tarmac Construction, so there were students from Tarmac. There was a couple of the big guys in there, and we spent most of our time talking about this particular contract and tender submission. I know we shouldn't have, but we were, because everybody was worried about security because it was a hot spot of crime. So we had to take site security into consideration big time in this particular site. All right, not just all the other things, the lack of, for instance, infrastructure. There was one road up this mountain and one road down it, and it was a sort of like back in the day. It was infrastructure, particularly in that area of Wales, wasn't particularly good. So you had that you had those issues. I think Amy won the actual, but everybody went in. Nobody went in tight. Everybody went in quite put a lot of profit and things like that, because they were all quite risk averse. With regards to this particular, I think Amy Fairclough, as they were at the time, won the contract, and kids were just getting on the site and just stealing things left, right, and centre. Um, so you can those are the sorts of things that you need to take into consideration. Um, Internal company risks. Again, what's your commitment? Okay, are you working at capacity, 100% capacity? Are you 10%, 20% either side, which would be fine? But if you go below 80%, 85%, maybe even 90%, it would depend on the company policy. But when I worked in Kia, it would be sort of 80%. So, for instance, if we were working at 80% capacity, we could sort of employ a lot of our site managers, for instance, that had come from the trades. Most of them, a lot of them were carpenters. We could employ them on a lot of our maintenance contracts that we had at the time, our framework contracts that we had. So we could work at 80%, 85% capacity, where a lot of contractors and smaller contractors in particular can't. You know what I mean? If you've got a site manager or a quantity surveyor that's partially employed on 50 grand, that's a lot of money for a smaller company. You can absorb it a little bit more with the bigger companies. All right. Are you expanding? Yeah. Are you winning? What's going on at the moment. Again, just to sort of give you, again, based on my experience, that's all. I remember one of my students back in the day, HNC student, he worked for a small company in Cardiff. That's all they would do is refurb student accommodation. A couple of contracts with Cardiff University, Glamorgan University, and Newport University at the time, University of Wales, as it was sort of commonly known, in the student accommodation. So they would replace doors and frames, repaint, bathroom, nothing big. And they had been winning the contracts regularly, and suddenly they were losing them. And it was their bread and butter work. They had other contracts, but it was their bread and butter work. Now, I'm talking back in 2009, 2010, when the market took a dip, a big dip. Probably, we went into recession, and we're sort of still living in many respects. We're still living with that recession at the moment, but not in the construction industry, because the construction industry has gone up since then. But in 2008 to 2014, we were really in a dip. We're in a sort of mini bubble at the moment, I suppose. And they couldn't understand why they were losing, so they asked me to do some analysis for them. So I went in, did some analysis based on who was winning and who was winning the contract, and it was because they were going in with their preliminaries were just too high. Their preliminaries, which with a small refurb I can understand, but they were really high. They were something like 30%, and basically they had just got used to winning these contracts with the universities, with the student accommodation, doing all the refurbs. From the small refurbs, anything up to about 250,000, we're talking now, back in, like I said to you, 2010. So you've got to do an analysis sometimes. And they weren't, because the guy who ran the company was a carpenter, and they didn't have any quantity surveyors as such. They just used to sort of, they knew the prices, and then they would just submit this sort of bog standard price every time, really. But when I looked at the prelims, I'd say, well, your prelims are about 30%, and I expect, because the market's so keen at the moment, people are going in maybe with 10% or 5% with their prelims, and so again, it sort of look at your recent tendering record. Why are you winning? Why are you losing? Can you afford to lose? And again, if I go back to Kia's, and again, I'm talking about a recession year, because it's much more difficult to win contracts. When I was in Kia's during the recession in 92, 93, which was a big recession in the construction industry, much bigger than 2008, I think, if I remember. We weren't winning any contracts, and everybody else around us was winning. So Turner Construction, which was a regional based in Cardiff, Salopian, which was based in Shrewsbury, but also had an office in Cardiff, and Kia's, and we were all sort of bidding for the same sort of stuff. And we kept losing to these two. But we had a manager who just kept saying, look, let's just hold our nerve here. Because we knew that they were going in maybe at a loss, maybe minus 10%, maybe minus 5%. And like I say, look, I was probably doing I think I was doing my, uh, the CIO, you didn't do degree back then, so you did your CIOB and you did part 1, part 2, and part 3. So by that time, I was probably doing part 3 of my CIOB then. And which is your final bit of your CIA before you become full member. And there were people in there working for Turners, working for Salopia, and I used to hear them, oh yeah, Kias are going to go bust because they keep losing. And look, we held our nerve. We didn't win any contracts. We held our nerve. I remember it. And everybody thought, we're going to lose our jobs here now. And then all of a sudden, Turner went through. Then Salopian went through. And when I say went through, they went bankrupt. And what happened was the clients had to give their jobs to us because we were, we were the sort of the third highest or the fourth highest tender bids at that particular time. So they give it to us to do, and we had gone in properly. And what that allowed us to do was to go in and actually make a profit. And I always remember that period because I remember, as I say, he was my mentor as well. I mentioned him. Jim French would just say to us, keep your nerve. They're going to go bust now. I've heard it on the grapevine. And you hear these things on the grapevine. You keep networking and all of that kind of thing. So your recent tendering record, yes, do an analysis. And I'm sure we would have done an analysis on why we don't win. But if your analysis is okay and you think, look, I've actually got a good strategy here, you know what I mean? And I can afford to see this out, which we could as Kias, we could. Then hold your nerve and see what happens. However, if you're not a Kia of this world, then you might not be able to hold your nerve, and then you've got to really look at it and maybe start cutting costs. Okay? So again, what I'm trying to say, to take it back to, I know I'm being a bit colloquial here, and a bit sort of fireside chat. Don't just use my experience, use yours. Think about how you deal with things, and I don't know, maybe you all work in silos, I was very lucky that I didn't in Kias. I appreciate things have changed in the industry now. But, ask your mentors questions like this. Look, be careful. Don't talk about it in the lessons because we used to, that's market intelligence. Like I say, I used to listen to the guys, the QSs and site managers from Turners and from Salopia. And they would all say to me, you're going to go best, you're going to go best. Do you want a job with us? And I just had this faith in Jim French because he was my mentor. And I wouldn't say anything. I'd say, we'll see. And, Jim produced, Jim was right. Hence why he probably went on he did go on to become the managing director or one of the managing directors of Kias. Anyway, what I'm trying to say there is, again, it's asking you to analyse, to evaluate why there is this difference. When you go through the RIBA plan of works, you might start off with a cost estimate based on functional floor area. You might start on a cost estimate based on GIFA, gross internal floor area, or GFA as it's called now. Yes, follow the rules in the NRM1. Makes it accurate. As accurate as you can be at that particular time. As you move through it, the budget is going to change because the information gets more. Obviously then, yours is based, when you use NRM1, it's based on very scientific, objective principles that are laid out in the NRM1. Again, when you're quantifying for an estimate for a bunch of contractors to base their estimate on, and you produce a bill of quantities, then again, you're using NRM2. And again, it's very scientific. How you set it out is you saw it. We must follow this. We must follow that. It's standardized. It's generalized. When it's generalized, it means it's comparable. You can compare and contrast. It brings consistency. It brings a degree of certainty. All these things do. These are the advantages with it. However, when you then bring in commercial risk into the equation, that objectivity suddenly changes because the view for the objectivity changes, because the contractor and the subcontractor have got to start to think what's right for them. And also, they will view it in a very different way because they're set up. The different organisations they're going to set up in a different way. A regional organisation may not see it in the same way as a national organisation. So they will come at it from very different reasons. And as I said, a national organisation needs to make sure that it covers its general overheads, its office costs, etc., 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 marketing, all of these things. They're going to be much, much more expensive, or higher then I should say, for the national or international contractor than they are going to be for the regional contractor. You know, ultimately, there's an argument the regional contractor can operate from their home these days. Yeah? Okay? I don't think there's an argument for a national contractor to do that. Some of the professionals, yes, can, but you need that base for your accountancy department, for your compliancy department, you know, for your contracts maybe department, you know, the people who view the, you know, part of the compliancy department. The architects, if you've got a design and build sort of component. The engineers, if you've got a civil engineering I'm trying to think, a structural engineering component, you know what I mean? Like we had, you know, when you're dealing with concrete cancer, those types of things. So you're going to need an office, you know, so therefore that's going to cost you quite a bit of money. All right, marketing, part of your general overheads, you know, electricity costs, gas, heating, I should say, you know, all of these things got to be paid for. So they're going to be more for a national, international contractor than they are a regional contractor. And you're going to be up against regional contractors with regards to this particular contract. And it depends, like I say, it depends on your network within that region, especially particularly amongst regional contractors. All right, it depends on your capacity. Depends on, do I want to expand? Depends on how much do I need to win this contract? And that's the reason that you will have so many different sort of submissions, and that's why they'll be very different to the initial budgets. And obviously, when you come in to select your contractor, when the PQS advises the client on which one to select out of, say, the 6 that have submitted a tender, they're going to be somebody that's very close to that initial or that original budget. Somebody that's very close to the original budget. You know, it might not be the lowest one. It might not be the highest one. So it's going to be usually somebody in the middle. Let's just generalize it. And so it's going to be, you know, it's going to be somebody who's got maybe the 3rd, 4th or 5th tender price, you know, in terms of sort of lowest to highest. You know, the person who goes in low, you might want to check, you know, because there'll be a rigorous check-in procedure done by the PQS, and they also sort of submit it to some statistical analysis based on probability and all of this kind of thing, and they'll do this sort of probability analysis, and you know, and there'll be things involved like standard deviation and normal distribution curves and all this kind of thing, you can even do sort of linear regression if you wanted to, but you know, I may be going over the top there. But what I'm saying is, you'll submit it to that to see which one will probably be the best one to choose. And these days, with the tools that we've got now, AI and digital twins and all of this kind of thing, it'll be much easier to make that analysis, or less riskier with regards to that. And they'll choose somebody that's much, much more able to carry out the contract. Because sometimes when you sort of check in submission tender prices, you know, sometimes you look at a tender submission and you can see that particular contract, probably some of the smaller ones, I really don't have a clue on how to, maybe they're moving into an area that's they're not familiar with, they don't have the expertise in. and sometimes that is evident in their tender submissions. Okay, so that's why they come out as maybe the lowest one. All right, so you've got to check, and the maths might be wrong as well. So you want to check their maths maybe. Um, okay, so the program as well. Obviously, it's much riskier in this country to work in winter than it is in summer, as you can imagine. You know what I mean? Um, Depends on what commodities you have to buy. You know what I mean? I can go on and on about this. You know what I mean? For instance, is it fixed or fluctuating price as well? So it depends on some of the terms in the contract. Is it fixed price? Fixed price can be a nightmare, but some could say it's safer because if you're buying it at that particular price, it's going to stay at that particular price, particularly if you've got a 3-year contract, a 3-year duration for your contract. You want to sort of be buying steel maybe at the same price today as you're going to buy it in 3 years' time. However, steel prices fluctuate because they're a commodity. Depends on the international market, and if something, out of the ordinary happens, you know what I mean? Trying to sort of sail ships through the Red Sea is a nightmare, obviously, at the moment, or was. And if you're buying your steel from China, or you're buying your steel, maybe it's not too bad from China because the Yemenis let them through. But if you're buying it from India, maybe you might have to go all the way around South Africa. Another major steel producer was Ukraine. They're out of the picture. So there's the competitive nature of the international market suddenly changes. Because where you might buy cheap steel from, India, maybe Ukraine, suddenly their prices have gone up because of transport fees, because they're in the middle of a war, earthquake, whatever it could be, any sort of natural disaster or man-made disaster affects the international market, particularly commodities market, you know what I mean? Supply and demand, if there's more steel on the market, obviously the price will go down. If there's less steel, the price goes up. So you got your supply and demand sort of graphs and curves and everything as well. And all of that kind of maths as well that you might want to sort of play around with. So you've got all of that type of thing, I remember we needed supply. I was working in the buying department for a while, and I'd buy a load of marine ply for formwork with a big concrete project on. However, at the time, and I'm showing my age now, Cardiff Bay Barrage was being built, which was the biggest civil engineering contract in Europe at the time, and one of the only ones in Great Britain at the time, actually. And I couldn't buy marine ply for love nor money. It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare because it was all being bought and used by Cardiff Bay Barrage. You know what I mean? And in the end, I managed to get it through a contact I had in a Cardiff timber company that had a contact in Canada. So I had to wait a week extra for it, but I got it quite cheap and it came into Tilbury Docks, thank God. So those sorts of things, you've got to have those contacts. They I'm talking, I'm obviously talking during the contract there because I'm a buyer or a quantity surveyor that's seconded to the buying department. But nobody had taken that into consideration when they tendered for this particular thing, which they should have really, because Cardiff Barrage was a very famous contract at the time, very similar to Hinkley Point C and maybe the nuclear power station Sizewell C as well. If that goes ahead, these big contracts amongst the the nuclear power, the railway that goes past Birmingham, HS2, these the Cardiff Bay Barrage was the sort of HS2 of its time. So you should have taken it into consideration, but again, it depends on how much you want that contract, and we wanted that contract, because we are talking early to mid 90s when the market was quite depressed at the time. So distance from the head office, obviously the further you go away, the riskier it gets. All right, and you've got to pay people's travel, you've got to pay people's fees if they stay in the night. When we worked in mid Wales in the middle of winter, doing some concrete cancer stuff, we had to sort of put people up for the night. You know what I mean, including ourselves. Costs money, costs a lot of money. All right. So overall, commercial risk profile. I would say this particular project. This is a different. I based it on a different one actually. I have given it out, so I don't know why it's not up on Moodle. But with regards to yours, let's just take yours. I would say that's quite a low to medium risk project. It's quite straightforward. It's mainly masonry, with maybe a steel or a timber sort of truss roof, and flat roof. Sorry, so it's a sort of, not a flat roof, but sort of monopitch roof. If you're wondering why you don't have to worry about doing the gable ends, because I didn't make you do the gable ends with regards to the takeoff, to simplify it. So it's a flat roof, quite straightforward, timber, and like I say, it's only got really one it's got a sorry. It's a cavity wall construction. It's a raft foundation with a bit of steel. One story. It's not really a particularly difficult or risky endeavour. However, a lot of contractors might want to win it for that reasons, particularly local contractors. So a lot of people will when I say a lot, you're only talking, if you're going to do closed competitive tendering, you're only going to do 6 to 8 at the most anyway, aren't you? So, but anybody who goes for it will probably go in quite keen because they'll want it. Yeah. That I'm just generalising there, okay? But it would depend on the business environment at that particular time. Are we going through a bubble? Are we going through a bust or a bust or boom? We're going into we're in a sort of mini boom at the moment, aren't we? But it depends on region to region as well. If you go into Wales, for instance, at the moment, it's quite depressed outside of Cardiff and Swansea. Anything above the M4 is quite depressed. There's an argument it could be the very same in many respects for a lot of the rural areas, and certainly up north in England. Bit of a boom in Birmingham at the moment. It seems to continue. So again, it depends on how much work's out there and how much you need it. All right. So they are the things you need to talk about, and I would add it on to your original report that you're doing with regards to LO1 and LO2. Okay. Yep. And as I say, I myself, low to moderate risk tender strategy, contingency maybe. I wouldn't include in it. This is based on a different one that I sent to you guys. But with this particular one, you know what I mean, you're talking quite low risk, to be honest with you, because it's only a couple of month contract. Depends whether it's being done in the winter, because you're doing some. I wouldn't call it sophisticated, but a raft foundation is a little bit more sophisticated than a trench foundation and a strip foundation. Fixed price will be fine with this one. Increased size, it depends on where it is, and early procurement maybe. Key materials there are brick and block really. There's not that much concrete ultimately. Relatively speaking, I'm talking, it's not a road project or a bridge building project or concrete frame in a building or anything like that, so it's quite small to medium risk. So in many respects, it's actually probably going to reflect the original budget. But as I say, look, the 6 submissions, because I would say a lot of contractors might want that job because it's a nice little job, that one is. They might go in quite keen. So you might find it actually lower than the budget. But they're things that you can talk about with regards to when you're contextualizing your work. You know, I read a couple and some really good contextualization, by the way, which is what I would expect to see from a very good distinction. I don't, you know, it doesn't have to be very well contextualized. I expect to see some contextualization and conceptualization, but the ones I've read, really good up to now. Just add those bits in that I've just mentioned there, okay? I will go through pricing with you again. That'll probably be tomorrow at the moment, and then I'll send it off to you, okay, guys? It's been over an hour, so I'm afraid, sorry about it. Watch it, ask me loads of questions, and keep submitting your work for me to have a look at. Now I'm sort of out of holiday mode. You know, I was in Wales for last weekend. I was in. I'm in London tomorrow. Now I'm out, sort of coming out of holiday mode, going back into work mode. I'm back into it. Yeah. So yeah. All right, guys. Thank you. Take care. Happy New Year to you all. By the way, I should have said that at the beginning.